some rhythm or something that looks akin to this, as Mark Twain's quote here illustrates, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Welcome back for chapter 2 of our reading series. We are reading Mastering the Market Cycle by Howard Marks. For those of you who don't know who Howard Marks is one of the founders of Oak Tree Capital, based out in California, and they have a very good track record as being one of the top distressed assets investment firms, private equity, hedge fund, a really successful financial services business. All right, so what is in store for chapter 2? Chapter 2 is titled The Nature of Cycles. Without going into too much detail, quick overview. This is where the author starts describing a bit more what he deems as a cycle, how he visualizes a cycle, why that's important. He introduces secular cycles and the importance of that as well. So without further ado, let's switch up the camera angle. The nature of cycles. So I think let's begin by talking about the way Howard visualizes a cycle and how he uses a pendulum to think about a cycle. So a pendulum is something where you have essentially something that goes like this, and then you're gonna have a line, and then at the end of the line you're gonna have like a little weight, and this is gonna be able to swing backwards and forwards. So if I had to take here and I had to pull this pendulum, it would swing. You'll be able to swing on this plane. So just facing a pendulum forward, you're gonna get a motion like that. The ball's gonna travel along this plane, and it's gonna have a peak and a trough on either side. But to get closer to what a market cycle looks like, he says, what if you take this pendulum and you flip it? You flip it like this. So we're not going to be able to see too much definition here. Maybe it's a little lopsided. But now the arc is going to be over here. So the pendulum is going to be able to swing backwards and forwards. And again, we have our peaks, trough, and a peak. So what if we take our pendulum and we tilt it and we pick it up and we drop it, but instead of just letting it drop, we let the swing move, have another axis. So have another axis here. And so we pick it up and we let it swing, and then we drag it along. We drag it along in this direction. So then we're gonna get something like this starting to form. Right? Now, what if we go even one step further? What if we keep it at an angle? Right? I'm going a little far here. Just a little bit. I'll leave it like that. Yeah. So we've got time and some sort of value here. Usually, in our case, it's probably going to be price. So when Howard Marks uses the verbiage, the pendulum swings to the other direction, it means he's referring to these peaks and troughs that can be derived from taking a pendulum and tilting it. So this is how I believe Howard Marks visualizes a pendulum. And this is also what you think of as a cycle. You've got a trough, a peak, and then another trough, another peak and a trough. But then there's another idea. There is an average, a mean. Let's start using a different color for this. We have a mean, and this is referred to as a secular trend. So in the short term, we could have these pendulum swings up and down. So here we could be saying we are in an uptrend. Here we could be saying we are in a down trend. But there's also a secular trend, which can, in this case, would be a secular uptrend. This gives you something funny that Howard Marks often refers to is a quote by Mark Twain, and that goes roughly as history So this is a very simplified way. We know in reality that very few markets will make such a symmetrical trend lines. There's probably going to be some rhythm or something that looks akin to this, as Mark Twain's quote here illustrates. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, meaning that things could look similar, but it's never going to look exactly the same again. So that is something important also to note with cycles. Okay, the next concept that Howard starts to introduce is this idea of causality. I think it can be problematic to think too much in terms of cause and effect, but if protected with the right limitations and parameters, thinking in causality is fine. Anyways, so he states the events in the life of a cycle shouldn't be viewed merely as each being followed by the next, but much more importantly, as each causing the next. All right, so let's get back to our handy charts here. Okay, so as we've previously seen, a cycle looks something like this with a secular trend running through it. So we can define, or we can look at cycles in different phases. You could have phase A, B, okay, that's a lot of phases, but essentially A seems to be this upward trend, and then B is this kind of pivotal point. There's like a pivot here where momentum is lost and slowed down, and we pivot and go back into a downward direction. And similarly, we have another pivot point where things turn around again and start moving in an upward direction. So those are very important to look at. Another thing that's very important to look at is to think of this as the proper value or level. And this delta here as noise, or deviance from the norm, or deviance from the proper value. So what is an investor to do with these values? Well, these are very important values to know. So not only do we have these different phases in a cycle, those phases are very important. So I'm going to say point C, E, G, and I. So C, E, G, and I. These are what's called inflection points. This is when the market goes beyond. So you would think that in a rational market, once we extend, the market overextends and pulls back, and it comes back down to the norm, to the proper level, you'd think it would stay there and be rational, but it doesn't. It overshoots and pulls further to the other extreme. So these inflection points are very dependable in Howard Marks's opinion, and are very critical for a good investor to understand. Because what happens is the market extends itself, and he explains it as the market gains more weight. And so it reaches a point where essentially gravity, the momentum upwards is less than what the pull is, the gravity pull towards the mean is, and it'll start pulling that weight back down. And as it sheds weight, then it becomes light enough to where the momentum induced by the mean can then start pulling it upwards again. And in that way, we have this gaining of weight and shedding of weight, right? So this gaining and shedding of weight is kind of where this causality starts coming in his view. In that because the market had overextended itself and the gravity gained weight, that in of itself is what starts to cause the movement, pulling it back down. So B actually causes C. Now, another important thing is then the human condition, human behavior. So at points C, E, at these inflection points here, as we start moving down, people start becoming irrational. And they don't realize that, hey, we've actually reached a mean point. We've actually reached the proper value. They will get fearful. So here we've got, in this direction, we have fear. And in this direction, we've got exuberance. Hope I'm spelling that right. We've got this dynamic of fear and exuberance working as well. And in Howard Marks's opinion, the successful investor understands these inflection points very well and is able to make their investment decisions very, very well. Okay. All right, last concept that I want to cover is experience. So experience, Howard Marks brings up this very critical point in experience. So these cycles, they can take decades. So from here to here, this could be 20 years. So in time, this could be about 20 years. So in 20 years, you've only gone through essentially one bear market. And one bull. And that's very, very critical. If you think about, most people work from their mid-20s to their mid-60s, well, that's about 40 years of working. So that's about 40 years. So most people will only go through about 2 bear markets and 2 bull markets in their whole career in finance. It's very difficult you need to go through bear markets and bull markets in order to gain experience, but they just come around so very slowly. So it's very important, because markets take this long, you must study history, because otherwise you can't gain a lot of experience by just waiting to go through these bull markets and bear markets. And that's also why it's very good that you're here listening to this video and watching this video, because we're going to go through historical events as well. All right, that is it for today. All right, thank you so much for sticking around and watching that video. I hope you learned something from it. Yeah, stay tuned for chapter 3.